The first thing I smelled was his cologne, that heavy, expensive sandalwood scent that used to make me vomit in 10th grade. Now, it was filling my mother's kitchen. I looked up from the sink and saw Julian Vance standing on our porch, holding a bottle of wine and kissing my mom's cheek. My ribs still throbbed where he'd shoved me into the doorframe 5 minutes ago, a hit he'd masked as a clumsy stumble. I have exactly 10 hours until my graduate scholarship is revoked and my mother loses everything. I thought our neighbor, Michael, was my only ally until I saw him wink at Julian. They aren't strangers. They're partners. Julian didn't just find my mother by accident. He bought her. And as he leaned in to whisper that he'd kill her if I said a word, I realized the most terrifying part. My mother already knows who he is. She just thinks I'm the one who hunted him. Let me take you back to where this began. The brass knob chilled Sarah's palm as she pulled the door open. Diane stood on the welcome mat, a manic brightness in her eyes, clutching the arm of the man beside her. Sarah's lungs seized. The scent of expensive sandalwood and rain rolled off him, a smell she associated with the sterile silence of a hotel room 3 years ago. Julian Vance smiled. It wasn't the predatory grin from her nightmares, but something softer, practiced for domestic audiences. Sarah felt the air in the entryway turn thick and unbreathable, like the humidity before a summer storm in the Georgia suburbs. "Sarah, honey, you're gaping," Diane chirped, her fingers tightening around Julian's charcoal sleeve. "This is Julian. I mentioned him on the phone. My Julian." The porch light flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across Julian's face. He stepped forward, extending a hand. His skin appeared waxen under the yellow bulb, his fingernails buffed to a high shine. Sarah's pulse thudded against her eardrums, a rhythmic drumming that drowned out the evening crickets. She gripped the doorframe until the wood bit into her skin. "It's a pleasure to finally meet Diane's sister," Julian said. His voice carried a smooth, melodic resonance that made the hair on Sarah's neck bristle. It was the same voice that had once whispered promises of special mentorship in the back of a darkened classroom. She stared at his outstretched palm. A small, crescent-shaped scar paled his thumb, the mark she had left when she fought his grip in that hallway years ago. Diane's laughter bubbled over, thin and brittle. "Don't mind her, Julian. She's had a long shift at the clinic. Sarah, move aside. We brought wine." Julian's eyes locked onto Sarah's. The warmth in his expression didn't reach those dark, empty irises. He waited for her to yield, his presence an invisible weight pressing against the threshold of her home. Sarah's tongue felt like lead. She stepped aside, her shoulder brushing the cold plaster of the entryway as he crossed into her sanctuary. The hallway felt narrower the moment he entered. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, rectangular edge of her digital voice recorder. She pressed the button through the fabric of her jeans. Click. The tiny red light was invisible to the world, but to her, it was a lifeline. Entry 1, front door. 6:14 p.m. Subject is in the house, she whispered under her breath, a habit born of years of being told her memory was a broken thing. "Did you say something, dear?" Diane asked, already heading toward the kitchen to find wine glasses. "Just checking the time," Sarah managed. Her ribs ached with a phantom pressure, a memory of how Julian used to lean over her desk, his body a wall of silent intimidation. Outside, a shadow moved across the driveway. Michael Davis, their neighbor from 2 doors down, was walking up the path. He held a plastic container, likely the peach cobbler he'd promised Diane earlier that morning. Michael was a man of loud laughs and heavy footfalls, the kind of person who seemed too solid to be part of a nightmare. "Hey there, saw the lights on," Michael called out, his voice booming through the screen door. He paused at the threshold, his gaze shifting between Sarah's white-knuckled grip on the door and the tall, elegant stranger standing in the middle of the living room. Julian turned, his silver-templed head tilting with the grace of a predator. He didn't move toward the door. He waited for the world to come to him. "Michael, perfect timing," Diane called from the kitchen. "Come meet Julian." Michael stepped inside, but he didn't head for the kitchen. He looked at Sarah. He saw the way she was vibrating, the way her eyes were pinned to Julian like a bird watching a snake. Michael's smile faltered. He set the cobbler on the hallway table and stepped closer to Sarah, his hand reaching out as if to steady her. "Everything okay here, Sarah? You look like you've seen a ghost." Julian's silver coin appeared between his knuckles. Clink. He flipped it, the metal catching the light. Clink. The sound was like a hammer hitting a nail in Sarah's mind. "She's just surprised, I imagine," Julian said, stepping forward. He didn't walk around Michael. He walked into his space. Surprise can often look like distress to the untrained eye. The tension in the air was a physical thing, a cord stretched to the point of snapping. Michael narrowed his eyes, his rugged face hardening. "I wasn't talking to you, buddy." "Sarah?" Sarah tried to speak, to scream, to tell Michael that this man was a monster who had hollowed out her teenage years. But Julian moved. It was a fluid, practiced motion. He reached out as if to catch his balance, his shoulders slamming into Sarah's chest. It looked like a stumble. To Diane, watching from the kitchen doorway, it looked like Julian had tripped over the rug. But Sarah felt the focused, sharp impact of his elbow against her ribs. The air fled her lungs in a silent gasp. She stumbled back against the wall, the plaster cracking behind her head. "Oh goodness, I am so sorry," Julian exclaimed, his voice dripping with false concern. He reached out, his hand clamping onto Sarah's arm, not to help, but to squeeze. The rug caught my heel. "Are you all right, Sarah?" She couldn't breathe. The pain in her side was a hot poker, and his hand on her arm felt like a brand. Michael lunged forward, his hand catching Julian's wrist. "Watch it," Michael growled. "You're hurting her." "Michael, please," Diane cried, rushing forward. "It was an accident. Julian is the clumsiest man I know. Don't be so aggressive." Julian let go, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. The silver coin disappeared back into his pocket. "Quite right. My apologies. I'm still getting used to the layout of the house." Sarah slumped against the wall, her hand clutching her side. Her vision swam, but as Julian turned to soothe Diane, his charcoal coat swung open. The leather case of his smartphone was visible in the inner pocket. It was a gamble, a desperate, impulsive move. As Julian leaned in to kiss Diane's cheek, Sarah reached out. Her fingers were trembling, but she was fast. She had spent years learning to be invisible, to move without making a sound. Her hand dipped into the silk lining of his coat. She felt the cold glass of the phone. She pulled it out and slid it into the waistband of her leggings, covered by her oversized sweater, all in the space of a heartbeat. She had it. The key to his life. The evidence he kept hidden. I need some water," Sarah rasped, her voice coming back in a thin whistle. "Of course, honey," Diane said, her eyes still fixed on Julian with a terrifying devotion. "But before you go, Julian has something he wants to tell you. It's why we're celebrating." Julian smiled, and this time The darkness in his eyes was triumphant. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out a heavy cream envelope. "Sarah," he said softly, "I know how hard you've worked for your graduate studies, and I know the financial burden has been significant. I wanted our first meeting to be a positive one. I've spoken with the board at the university. I've made a private endowment in your name. Your entire tuition, the housing, the research grants. It's all been taken care of. Consider it a gift from the family." The floor seemed to tilt. Sarah's hand, still pressed against the stolen phone at her waist, went cold. She looked at her mother, who was beaming with tears in her eyes. "Isn't it wonderful?" Diane whispered. "He's saved your future, Sarah. We owe him everything. The predator hadn't just entered her home, he had bought her life. Subverted beat 1.4. The benefactor's trap." Sarah stood frozen in the center of the living room, the stolen phone a heavy, burning weight against her hip. This was the moment she was supposed to win. She had the device. She had a witness in Michael. She opened her mouth to scream the truth, to tell Diane about the special sessions after school, the way Julian had made her feel like a criminal for her own trauma. "Mom, you don't understand," Sarah began, her voice gaining strength. "This man, he isn't who you think he is. I know him. I know what he did at the high school." "Sarah, stop," Diane interrupted, her voice uncharacteristically sharp. She stepped forward, placing a hand on Julian's chest as if shielding him from a physical attack. "I won't have you ruining this with your episodes. Julian told me you might be overwhelmed. He's been so patient." "It's perfectly understandable," Julian added, his voice a soothing balm. "A surprise of this magnitude can be a shock to the system. The debt, the pressure, it's all gone now, Sarah. You can finally just be a student." Sarah felt a surge of hope. If she could just explain the scholarship was a bribe, a way to buy her silence, Michael would see it. Michael was still standing there, his brow furrowed, his eyes darting between Sarah's distress and Julian's calm. He was a good man. He would help her. "Michael, tell her," Sarah pleaded. "You saw him hit me. You saw what he did." Michael opened his mouth to speak, but Diane cut him off, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "He didn't hit you, Sarah. He tripped, and thank God he was here to catch you. Do you have any idea what he's done for us? Look at this." Diane snatched a document from the coffee table, a formal letter with the university's gold-embossed seal. "The anonymous donor who saved your scholarship last month? The one you cried about because you thought you'd have to drop out? It was him. It was Julian. He's been looking out for you long before he even met me formally. He did it because he remembered you as a bright light from his teaching days." Sarah felt the air leave the room. The hope she had built, the idea that she could simply name him and watch him fall, shattered like glass. Julian wasn't just a boyfriend. He was her benefactor. He had strategically placed himself as the savior of her career. If she accused him now, she wasn't just a victim speaking her truth. She was an ungrateful child biting the hand that fed her. I didn't know," Sarah whispered, her legs feeling like water. "Of course you didn't," Julian said, stepping closer. He reached out and tucked a stray hair behind her ear. His fingers were ice cold. "I wanted it to be a surprise. I wanted you to know that your future is secure with us. With me." The trap was perfect. To the outside world, Julian Vance was a saint. To Michael, he was a generous man being harassed by a confused girl. To Diane, he was a miracle. Sarah looked down at the floor, the weight of the stolen phone now feeling like a leaden shackle. She had the evidence, but the context had been rewritten. She wasn't an accuser anymore. She was a debtor. And in this house, Julian Vance held all the receipts. The kitchen was a landscape of stainless steel and sharp edges. The smell of the roasting chicken in the oven was cloying, mixing with the lavender wax Diane used on the floors. Sarah stood by the sink, her hands under the cold water, trying to stop the shaking. Julian appeared in the doorway. He didn't make a sound. He simply was there, a shadow that had detached itself from the wall. "The water in this town is quite hard," he observed, leaning against the doorframe. "It leaves a residue, much like a bad reputation." Sarah didn't turn around. "I'm going to the police, Julian. I have the recordings. I have your phone." Julian laughed. A soft, dry sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Do you? And what will you tell them? That the man who just paid $80,000 for your education is scary? That he accidentally bumped into you in front of your mother and a witness who thinks you're having a mental breakdown?" He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the linoleum. "I've already called Dean Miller, Sarah. We had a lovely chat about your academic stress. I told him you were struggling with the transition, perhaps even hallucinating a bit. He was very sympathetic. He told me that if there are any outbursts, your scholarship might need to be reevaluated for your own mental health." Sarah turned, her back against the sink. "You're blackmailing me." "I'm protecting my investment," Julian corrected. He leaned in close, his sandalwood scent filling her lungs. "You will go out there. You will sit at that table. You will thank me for the wine and the tuition. And you will be the perfect, grateful daughter. If you don't, you'll be a high school dropout with a history of psychiatric instability. And I'll still be sleeping in your mother's bed." He reached out and tapped the pocket of her sweater where the recorder was hidden. Click. He had turned it off. "Check your batteries, darling," he whispered. "The truth is only what people are willing to hear. And right now, no one is listening to you." Sarah pushed past him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She needed to find Diane. She needed to show her the reality before Julian could finish weaving his web. She found her mother in the hallway, adjusting a picture frame that was slightly tilted. Diane's hands were fluttering near her throat, a nervous habit that had intensified since Julian arrived. "Mom, look at these," Sarah said, pulling her own phone out. She swiped through the gallery, showing the old emails she had saved, the ones from 3 years ago that she had kept in a cloud drive Julian didn't know about. "Look at the dates. Look at how he talked to me when I was 17. Diane barely glanced at the screen. "Sarah, we've been over this. You were a confused girl. Julian told me everything. He told me how you used to follow him to his car, how you made up stories to get his attention. He felt so sorry for you." "He's lying." Sarah's voice cracked. "He groomed me, Mom. He tracked me down. Don't you see? He didn't meet you by accident. He targeted you to get back to me. That is enough." Diane snapped, her face flushing a mottled red. "You are being cruel and ungrateful. This man has given us a life we never dreamed of. He's a gentleman. And you're just like your father, always looking for a reason to tear things down." Diane turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood. Sarah stood in the hallway, the silence of the house pressing in on her. She felt a draft and looked toward her bedroom. The door was closed. She walked to it and turned the knob. It wouldn't budge. She rattled it, the brass cold and unyielding. "Mom, did you lock my door?" No answer. Sarah leaned her shoulder against the wood and pushed. With a sickening crack, the cheap latch gave way. The room was dark. The only light came from the swaying branch of the oak tree outside, casting skeletal fingers across the walls. Sarah fumbled for the light switch. The room was a wreck. Her books had been swept from the shelves. Her desk was overturned. And in the center of the floor, the framed photo of her graduation, the one thing she was proud of, lay in a heap of shattered glass. The photo itself had been sliced. Julian's face, cut from a different picture, had been taped over her mother's. It was a desecration, a silent scream in the dark. Sarah backed out of the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She turned and ran down the hallway toward the front door. She needed Michael. Michael had seen the trip. Michael was a man of facts. She burst out onto the porch. The motion sensor light snapped on, blinding her for a second. "Michael," she screamed. "Michael, please." She saw him in the driveway, standing by his truck. But he wasn't alone. Julian was there, leaning against the hood of the Ford F-150. They were laughing. Julian reached out and clapped Michael on the shoulder, and Michael responded with a wide, easy grin. "Oh, Sarah," Michael called out, seeing her. "Julian was just telling me about the old days at State. Can you believe we were in the same fraternity? Small world, huh?" Sarah stopped at the edge of the porch. The world didn't feel small. It felt like a cage that had been shrinking for months, and she was only now noticing the bars. "Michael, I need to talk to you," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "About what happened in the house." Michael's smile dimmed just a fraction, replaced by a look of pity that was worse than anger. "Julian told me you've been under a lot of pressure with the finals, Sarah. Look, I get it. Brain's a funny thing when it's tired. Why don't you go back inside and have some of that cobbler? Julian and I are going to catch up on some old times." Julian flipped his coin. Clink. He looked at Sarah over Michael's shoulder, and for a fleeting second, the mask dropped. The cold, predatory hunger in his eyes was unmistakable. "Go on, Sarah," Julian said softly. "The family is waiting." Michael turned back to Julian, already lost in a story about a football game from 20 years ago. Sarah stood alone under the harsh glare of the floodlight. Her ally was gone. Her mother was lost. And the monster was home. The air in the living room was stagnant, the heavy velvet curtains drawn shut against the evening. Diane was humming as she set the table, a sound that felt like a funeral dirge to Sarah's ears. "Julian is moving his things into the guest house tonight," Diane announced, her voice light and airy, as if she were discussing the weather. "It makes more sense, doesn't it? Instead of him driving back and forth to the city, we'll be a real family." Sarah watched from the shadows of the hallway as Julian carried a leather suitcase across the yard toward the small cottage at the back of the property. He had the keys. He had the run of the place. She retreated to her room and locked the broken door with a chair propped under the handle. She pulled out the stolen phone. Her fingers flew across the screen. Try the birthday. No. Try the old classroom number. No. She closed her eyes, remembering the way he used to make her watch him type his passwords. A subtle way of showing her he had nothing to hide, because she was already his. 1-1-0-4. The date of their first anniversary. The phone vibrated and swiped open. Sarah's heart raced. She scrolled through the apps, looking for something, anything. She found a folder hidden behind a calculator icon. She tapped it. Emails, dozens of them. Subject: the mother. Target: Diane Johnson. Vulnerable, high debt, emotional void. There were photos of their house taken from the street months ago. There were copies of Diane's bank statements. Julian hadn't met Diane at a charity auction by chance. He had scouted her. He had studied her weaknesses like a general preparing for an invasion. He had planned his entry into their lives with the precision of a clockmaker. "Dinner's ready." Diane's voice echoed through the house. Sarah tucked the phone into her waistband and stood up. She felt a cold resolve settling into her bones. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a witness. She walked into the kitchen, heading for the pantry to grab the salt shaker Diane had asked for. The pantry was a narrow, deep closet filled with the scent of dried herbs and canned peaches. She stepped inside, her hand reaching for the shelf. The door slammed shut behind her. The light bulb overhead flickered and died, plunging her into total darkness. A heavy weight pressed against her back, pinning her against the wooden shelves. The sharp, metallic scent of a steak knife brushed against her throat. "You've been a very busy girl, Sarah." Julian's voice whispered in her ear. She could feel the heat of his body, the way his chest rose and fell against her shoulder blades. The edge of the knife was cold, a thin line of ice against her skin. "I know you have the phone," he said, "and I know what you're thinking. You think those emails matter? You think the truth is a weapon." He pressed the knife just a fraction harder. Sarah stopped breathing. "But here is the reality, darling. If you show those to anyone, if you even hint to your mother that I've been watching her, I will kill her. And I won't make it quick. I'll make it look like a tragic accident brought on by the stress of her unstable daughter." He leaned in closer, his lips brushing her ear. "I've spent a lifetime learning how to erase people, Sarah. Don't make me erase the only person who still pretends to love you." He pulled away, the pressure of the knife vanishing. The door opened, and the light from the kitchen spilled in, blinding her. Julian stood there, holding a bottle of red wine, a charming smile on his face. "Found the corkscrew, dear," he called out to Diane. "Sarah was just helping me find the right vintage." Sarah stumbled out of the pantry, her throat burning where the steel had rested. She looked at her mother, who was laughing at something Michael had said. Diane looked so happy. "So fragile." "Mom," Sarah rasped. She had to try. One last time. She pulled Diane into the hallway, away from the men. "Mom, please, I found things on his phone. He targeted you. He's dangerous. He had a knife in there." Subverted beat 3.5. The mother's confession. Sarah gripped Diane's shoulders, her fingers digging into the soft fabric of her mother's sweater. "Mom, listen to me. I'm not crazy. He just threatened to kill you in the pantry. He's been tracking us for months. I have the proof." She waited for the shock. She waited for Diane to finally wake up, to see the bruise forming on Sarah's ribs, to hear the terror in her voice. She had the emails. She had the physical evidence of his obsession. This was the moment the veil would lift. Diane didn't flinch. She didn't look horrified. Instead, a look of profound, weary sadness washed over her face. She reached up and gently uncoupled Sarah's hands from her shoulders. "I know, Sarah," Diane said softly. The world stopped spinning. Sarah stared at her, her mouth falling open. You know? You know he was my teacher? You know what he did?" "I know everything," Diane whispered, her voice steady and calm. "Julian told me weeks ago, before we even went on our first date. He came to me, Sarah. He sat me down and he cried. He told me how much he regretted what happened at that school." Sarah felt a cold dread pooling in her stomach. What did he tell you?" "He told me how you were a lonely, troubled girl," Diane said, her eyes filling with tears. "How you used to leave him notes. How you followed him to his car and threatened to hurt yourself if he didn't spend time with you. He told me he tried to help you, to be a mentor, but that you became obsessed. He said he had to leave the school because the scandal you tried to create almost destroyed his life. You are the one who won't let the past die. Sarah looked at her mother and saw a stranger. Julian hadn't just deceived Diane, he had recruited her. He had taken Sarah's trauma and flipped it, turning the victim into the villain and the predator into the martyr. "Mom, he had a knife," Sarah whispered, a final, pathetic plea. "He was cutting the roast, Sarah," Diane said, turning away. "Stop making scenes. You're embarrassing yourself, and you're hurting the only man who is willing to put up with us." Diane walked back into the dining room, leaving Sarah alone in the dark hallway. The trap wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Julian had poisoned the well of her own history, and now, even the truth sounded like a lie. The dining room was a theater of shadows. The chandelier flickered, plunging the room into rhythmic darkness every few seconds. Julian sat at the head of the table, carving the roast with practiced surgical precision. "A toast," Julian announced, raising a glass of deep crimson wine. "To new beginnings, to a family finally made whole." Michael raised his glass. Diane raised hers, her eyes shining with a terrifying blank adoration. Sarah sat still, her hands hidden beneath the table. She felt the weight of the recorder in her pocket. Click. "You've planned this for a long time, haven't you, Julian?" Sarah asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of the tremors that had plagued her all evening. Julian smiled, the light from the chandelier catching the silver coin on the table. "I've always believed in long-term investments, Sarah. Some things are worth the wait." "Like the scholarship?" she prompted. "The way you laundered the money through the university board to make sure I was tied to you?" Julian chuckled, the sound rich and arrogant. He was leaning back now, the wine loosening his tongue, the feeling of absolute victory making him careless. "It wasn't laundering, darling. It was a donation. People love a donor. They don't ask questions when the checks have enough zeros. And as for you, well, I knew you'd never come back to me on your own. You needed a reason. You needed to feel like you owed me. So you used my mother," Sarah said. "She was the path of least resistance." Julian shrugged. "She's a lovely woman, but she's so very empty. It was easy to fill that space with whatever story I wanted. And now, here we are. You're safe. She's happy. And I have exactly what I want." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You can record this, Sarah. You can tell the world. But who will believe you? To the dean, you're a mental case. To the police, I'm a philanthropist. And to your mother, you're just a liar." He took a long, deep swallow of his wine. Across the table, Sarah watched him. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. "You're right, Julian," she said softly. "People only believe what they can see, or what they can feel." Julian's brow furrowed. He went to set his glass down, but his hand fumbled. The crystal hit the wood with a dull thud, wine spilling across the white lace tablecloth like a spreading wound. I feel..." Julian started, his voice suddenly thick. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled. He slumped back into his chair, his head lolling to the side. Diane gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Julian? Julian, what's wrong?" Sarah stood up. She walked around the table and picked up Julian's glass. She looked at the dark liquid, then at the bottle of sedative she had swiped from the clinic weeks ago, the one she had been keeping for her own panicked nights. "The wine was a gift, wasn't it?" Sarah said, her voice echoing in the sudden silence of the room. "You brought it for Mom. You wanted her to sleep so you could have your talk with me." She looked at Diane, who was staring at Julian in horror. "I switched the glasses, Mom. While you were in the kitchen getting the napkins, I saw him put something in yours. I just returned the favor." Julian was breathing heavily now, his eyes rolling back in his head. The invincible predator was suddenly just a man, slumped and sweating in a dining room chair. Sarah pulled the recorder from her pocket. She pressed play. Julian's voice filled the room, clear, arrogant, and undeniable. "I knew you'd never come back to me on your own. I used my mother. She was the path of least resistance." The recording played on, capturing the full weight of his confession, the cold calculation of his grooming, the admission of his financial manipulation. Diane listened, her face going pale, then ashen. She looked at Julian, then at the recording, then at Sarah. The walls of the reality she had built began to crumble. The martyr was gone. The gentleman was a ghost. I didn't," Diane whispered, her voice breaking. "I know," Sarah said. She walked over and put her arm around her mother's shaking shoulders. It was the first time she had touched her without fear in years. "I know you didn't want to see it, but it's over now." The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, a low, pulsing hum that grew louder with every second. Sarah had sent the live audio to Officer Wilson 20 minutes ago. The front door burst open. The sterile, quiet peace of the house was shattered by the heavy boots of the police, the flash of red and blue lights reflecting off the windows. Officer Wilson stepped into the dining room, his jaw working, his eyes fixed on Julian. He didn't look at the wine. He didn't look at the roast. He looked at the recorder in Sarah's hand. "We have it, Sarah," he said, his voice a low hum that matched the sirens. "We have everything." They led Julian away, his silver-templed head hanging low, his hands cuffed behind his back. He didn't look like a monster anymore. He looked small. He looked insignificant. Sarah stood on the front porch, the cool night air filling her lungs. The smell of sandalwood was gone, replaced by the scent of damp earth and the coming morning. Diane stood beside her, her hand clutching Sarah's. She was crying, but for the first time, her eyes were clear. "I'm sorry," Diane whispered. "I'm so sorry." Sarah looked out at the street. The motion sensor light was still on, but it didn't feel like a crosshair anymore. It felt like a spotlight. The sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long golden lines across the driveway. The shadows were retreating. The house was quiet. Sarah reached into her pocket and felt the recorder. She didn't press the button. She didn't need to. For the first time in her life, she didn't need a tape to tell her she was real. She was home, and she was free.